After 40, money stops asking whether you are talented. It starts asking whether you are survivable. That is the first truth. When you are 25, the world lets you make ugly mistakes and still pretend you are early. You can lose money, waste years, chase nonsense, recover from a stupid decision, and still say life is long. Very often that is true. Time is still on your side in a way you do not deserve and rarely appreciate. But after 40, the game changes in one brutal, mathematical, and completely non-negotiable way. Your runway gets shorter. That is the metaphor I want you to keep in your head from the beginning. Runway, a plane, can be powerful, sophisticated, beautifully engineered, and full of fuel. But if the runway is short enough, one bad decision in speed, angle, or timing becomes much more expensive. A young person can often afford a sloppy takeoff and still correct in the air. A person after 40 is still fully capable of building wealth, but he can no longer afford the same degree of stupidity, denial, or self-inflicted drag. That is why the advice given to the young becomes dangerous when repeated lazily to people in midlife. Take more risk, swing harder, chase the next big opportunity, be aggressive, use leverage intelligently, keep up with the market, find the 10-bagger, think bigger, move faster. That language sounds energetic. It also quietly assumes time will forgive what judgment does not. Time is less forgiving after 40, not because you are old, because arithmetic gets harsher. The source document says the truth very plainly. Nobody wants to tell you the truth about getting rich after 40, because it is uncomfortable, not because it is complicated. You have less time. You have more to lose. And the rules that work for a 25-year-old can ruin you at 45 or 50. That is exactly right. The main shift is not that opportunity disappears. It is that recovery becomes more expensive and error becomes more permanent. Fay file a site, Fay turn 68, file 0 Fay. That is why I want to begin with a sentence most people hate, because it sounds too modest for their ego. After 40, stop trying to be brilliant and start trying not to be stupid. That does not sound glamorous. Good. Glamour has emptied a lot of accounts. The financial world is full of people who destroyed themselves while trying to look clever. They wanted a dramatic solution, a heroic trade, a masterstroke, a leap, a way to make up lost time in one magnificent burst. But the late game does not usually reward brilliance first. It rewards survival. It rewards the person who refuses to let one bad impulse, one ego-driven bet, one leveraged idea, one emotional reaction, or 1 year of denial blow up the runway he still has left. The source gives the arithmetic cleanly, and it deserves to be stated without softening. If you lose 40% of your money, you do not need 40% to get back. You need about 67%, lose 50%. And you need 100% just to stand where you started. That is not opinion. That is not pessimism. That is the geometry of damage. A 25-year-old can sometimes hand decades to that recovery. A 50-year-old may have 15 earning years left. That is a different game entirely. Fay file a site, Fay turn 68, file 0 Fay. This is why the first commandment of midlife wealth is not maximize upside. It is do not blow up the runway. People hear that and become offended because they think caution is a weak man's philosophy. It is not caution I am advocating. It is structural intelligence. If you have 20 years left to build, then the great enemy is not mediocrity by itself. The great enemy is permanent impairment, the loss from which the future has to crawl back uphill while time keeps shrinking behind it. That is why I agree with the source's reversal method so strongly. Do not begin by asking, how do I get rich after 40? Begin by asking, how do I make sure I stay poor after 40? That question is far more useful because it reveals the handful of fatal patterns that quietly destroy more lives than a lack of opportunity ever will. Fay file a site, Fay turn 68, file 0 Fay if you wanted to guarantee mediocrity. Or worse, after 40, the script would not actually be complicated. First, borrow money to invest. Second, spend slightly more than you earn. Third, become unreliable in ways that poison trust. Fourth, stop learning. Fifth, make decisions while emotional. That is enough. Follow those 5 patterns with consistency, and you can sabotage a tremendous amount of income, intelligence, and luck. Let us begin with leverage. Because leverage is the runway killer so many adults mistake for sophistication. The source says it with the sort of old-fashioned bluntness I admire. Intelligent men go bankrupt in 3 ways: liquor, women, and borrowed money. And the real killer is the last one. In markets, the human mind loves leverage because leverage flatters impatience. It whispers that you can make up time. It tells the late starter that borrowed force is wisdom. It tells the smart person that since he understands the opportunity, he should accelerate it. It lets people confuse conviction with fragility. Fay turn 68, file 0 Fay. That is why leverage is so seductive after 40. You started late. The ideal scenario is gone. There is distance between where you are and where you hope to be. So when leverage arrives offering speed, it does not look like danger. It looks like mercy. That is the lie. Borrowed money is not a growth tool for the underprepared middle-aged investor. It is a runway eater, because no matter how bright your analysis may be, no asset on earth is 100% certain, and any excellent return multiplied by 0 is still 0. That is what people forget. Great opportunities can survive bad timing if you are unleveraged. Great opportunities can destroy you if they are correct eventually, but wrong immediately, and you borrowed against the timing. That is why so many brilliant people still ruin themselves. Not because they lack IQ, because they think IQ can cancel fragility. It cannot. Leverage takes the normal pain of being wrong and turns it into a permanent event. That is tolerable when time is infinite and capital is tiny. It is ruinous when you are 47, your runway matters, and you are playing catch-up with borrowed force because you cannot emotionally tolerate slow accumulation. The second guaranteed route to late life mediocrity is spending slightly more than you earn, not wildly more. That is what makes it so lethal. A little more. A few hundred here, a little debt there, a lifestyle that expands just ahead of income rather than behind it. The source is right to emphasize how invisible this difference looks at first. The person who spends a little less than he earns and the person who spends a little more may look identical for years. They may drive similar cars, wear similar clothes, talk with similar confidence, even occupy the same social tier. But time is already separating them because one is quietly building runway while the other is quietly burning it. Fay turn 68, file 0 Fay. The world calls this a budgeting issue. It is not, it is a runway issue. If you spend a little more than you earn after 40, you are not only losing current money, you are shortening future choice. You are sacrificing optionality. You are making your margin for error thinner each year, while the world around you gets less forgiving. 1 year becomes 5, 5 becomes 10. By then, the difference is no longer invisible. One person has options, the other has chains. That is exactly the word the source uses, and it is correct, chains. Because overspending does not merely reduce wealth, it reduces movement. A person with thin margin cannot wait. He cannot say no easily. He cannot survive volatility calmly. He cannot endure the learning period of a new opportunity without panic. He needs next month too badly. Neediness is extremely expensive after 40. It makes you accept bad deals. It makes you hold bad jobs. It makes you chase easy-looking money. It makes you lie to yourself. The third failure pattern is less discussed and far more important than most people realize: unreliability. The source is excellent on this. After 40, wealth is no longer built by effort alone. It is built by confidence and trust. Opportunities travel through invisible networks, partnerships, recommendations, promotions, referrals, private deals, informal endorsements, quiet invitations into rooms that do not advertise their existence. All of that depends on one thing people love to underrate, because it sounds moral rather than financial. Can you be trusted? Fay turn 68, file 0 Fay Do. You show up. Do you keep your promises? Are you the same person under pressure? Can someone attach your name to theirs without getting burned? That is a wealth variable. And after 40, it matters more, not less, because your reputation has had longer to harden. Every broken promise burns a bridge. You no longer have the luxury of rebuilding 3 times. A 24-year-old can still be forgiven for immaturity. A 46-year-old who repeatedly flakes, delays, lies, overstates, rationalizes, or behaves unpredictably does not merely look messy. He becomes expensive to trust, and expensive to trust people are shut out of high-quality opportunities long before they know the door existed. The fourth fatal pattern is refusing to keep learning. This one is especially cruel because it feels safe while it is happening. You reach competence in your field, you have some wins behind you, you know enough to sound knowledgeable in familiar rooms. Then one day younger people start moving faster than you expected. New technology reshapes the edge. New distribution changes the game. New tools arrive. Your old competence stops appreciating and begins decaying. That is when many adults discover that experience and relevance are not synonyms. The source says it plainly. The knowledge that made you valuable at the 30th of May be worth very little at 50 if you stopped learning. At first the decline is slow and easy to deny, then the market reprices you all at once. That is one of the most painful forms of late life financial damage, because it feels unfair, even though the logic was visible for years. Fay turn 68, file 0 Fay. This is why I have always trusted readers more than talkers, not because reading is noble, because a person who keeps reading is usually still expanding his circle of competence, while other people are trying to live forever off an old version of themselves. That phrase matters too. Circle of competence, the source returns to it because it is one of the few ideas powerful enough to prevent a huge amount of adult self-destruction. After 40, your circle of competence is not a prison. It is a runway map. Inside it are the areas where you truly understand the forces at work. Outside it is ocean. Most spectacular late life financial damage occurs when someone with success in one arena decides that success is portable to everything. He built a company, so now he thinks he understands markets. He made money in property, so now he thinks he can outsmart venture investing. He solved one hard set of problems, so he assumes uncertainty will show the same respect in a different game. It will not. That is what intelligence without humility does. It persuades a man that because he was competent somewhere, he is broadly protected everywhere. The source is right that knowing where you are not competent is often more valuable than knowing where you are brilliant. That is not false modesty. It is strategic humility. It protects runway. Fay turn 68, file 0 Fay. This is why I have never been impressed by the sentence, I can figure it out, maybe you can. But after 40, you do not need heroic curiosity nearly as much as you need to avoid catastrophic ignorance. There is a huge difference. The fifth pattern is the one that quietly sits underneath all the others. Emotional decision, making panic when everything falls, greed when everything rises, self-pity when life disappoints, euphoria when one idea works, despair when one idea fails. The source says intelligence without emotional control is dangerous, and that is exactly right. Smart people with bad emotional discipline do not make ordinary mistakes. They make sophisticated mistakes. They can justify anything. They can build elegant arguments for their own ruin. They can rationalize leverage, overconfidence, and denial in sentences so polished they begin sounding like wisdom. Fay turn 68, file 0 Fay. That is why temperament matters more than brains in the late game. A person after 40 should be trying to become boringly rational, not theatrically brilliant. Rationality is an unfashionable virtue because it offers no glamour. It says examine the evidence. Change your mind when facts change. Question your own story. Search for disconfirming information. Ask the ugly question, what if I am wrong? The source makes a point here that I think almost nobody lives by, which is why so few avoid large mistakes. You do not have a right to an opinion until you can explain the arguments against it better than the people who hold them. That is a very high standard. It is also exactly the kind of standard that protects runway. Fay turn 68, file 0 Fay. Now let us move to the three traps the source identifies so well. Because these are not external conditions, they are inner weather patterns that destroy more people than bear markets do. The first trap is comfort. Comfort is one of the most expensive substances in midlife. It does not feel like danger. It feels like adulthood. A stable routine, a familiar job, a financial structure that mostly works if nothing goes wrong. You stop asking whether the life is good and begin asking only whether it is recognizable. That is how security becomes stagnation. The source is right. You build your own cage and then decorate it with the language of prudence. Fay turn 68, file 0 Fay. The second trap is the fear that it is already too late. This one destroys more late starters than low income ever will. They look at the gap between where they are and where they wish they were, and the distance embarrasses them. That embarrassment becomes paralysis. They tell themselves that if they cannot do it perfectly, there is no point starting imperfectly. That is denial disguised as realism. The source is exactly right to call it that. The person who says, I am late so I may as well do nothing, is not being honest. He is protecting himself from the pain of beginning smaller than he once imagined. Fay turn 68. File 0 Fay. The third trap is self-pity. This is the most toxic one because it feels justified. Everyone past 40 has some bruises, mistakes, losses, injustice, missed years, bad partners, bad bosses, divorce, illness, false starts, recessions, bad cycles, family pressure. You can make a case file. You can absolutely tell a true story about how life was unfair. But once you begin using that story as identity rather than context, you become a spectator in your own life. The source says that almost impossible to reverse moment begins when you start seeing yourself as a special victim instead of as someone who must now act from the position reality gave you. That is exactly right. Fay Philosite Fay turn 68 file 0 Fay self-pity does not make you softer. It makes you stationary, and stationary people do not build late wealth. Now I want to return to a detail in the source that is small in wording and enormous in value. Keep a record of your biggest mistakes. Some call it a temple of shame. I would call it runway protection. Write down the stupid decisions, the emotional decisions, the times you stepped outside your circle, the times you borrowed when you should not have, the times you ignored obvious evidence, the times you chased because other people were excited, the times you justified what you already wanted, the times your ego wanted to look smart more than your balance sheet wanted to survive. Most people forget or rationalize these moments because memory protects vanity. But vanity is expensive. A written record turns vague regret into usable pattern recognition. That is how adults reduce repeat stupidity. The goal is not self-punishment. The goal is to lower the odds that your future keeps resembling your past in the worst possible ways. Fay Philosite Fay turn 68 file 0 Fay. This is why denial is so dangerous. It keeps the runway short without ever admitting the plane is low. The source says denial is the silent engine of financial self-destruction in maturity, and I agree completely. The portfolio is too risky for your age, but you tell yourself you can handle it. You are not saving enough, but you say next year, your work situation is weakening. But you rely on comfort, you are stepping outside your circle. But you tell yourself this time is different. Denial is psychologically comforting and mathematically lethal. Fay Philosite Fay turn 68 file 0 Fay. That is why one of the most valuable questions after 40 is brutally simple. What am I denying right now? Not as therapy, as strategy. Now, let us discuss the first $100,000. The source says it is brutal, slow, unglamorous, and necessary. I think that is exactly right. People love millionaire fantasies because the big number protects them from the embarrassment of humble beginnings. But after 40, you do not have the luxury of contempt for the first hard milestone, 10,000. At 10%, barely moves the needle. 100,000 finally begins to matter. That is where your money starts doing visible work. That is why late starters do not need more risk nearly as much as they need more savings aggression, more expense discipline, and more income focus until the base becomes meaningful. Fay Philosite Fay turn 68 file 0 Fay. This is the part where adult life becomes offensive rather than defensive. Until the first serious base is built, the goal is not elegance. It is traction. You tighten what needs tightening. You increase income where you can. You cut drag. You stop leaking. You do the boring, ego-bruising work required to build the first pile that can eventually matter. A lot of people never do this because they are still fantasizing about the leap. They want a brilliant move, a hidden trade, a secret investment, a big swing. They do not want the slow, ugly period. But after 40, the slow, ugly period is often the only honorable door still open. Refusing it because it is not glamorous is simply another form of self-sabotage. Now let us look at the arithmetic the source ends with, because it is both uncomfortable and merciful. A person starting at 45 and saving $2,000 a month for 20 years at 7% can reach more than $1 million by 65. A person starting at 50 and doing the same for 15 years lands around $630,000. Start at 55 and 10 years produces something like $340,000 to $350,000. Those are not ideal outcomes compared with starting young. But they are. That is the moral force of arithmetic. Late is not ideal. Late is still powerful. The person who says it is too late and does nothing is not being realistic. He is choosing zero over imperfection because zero feels less humiliating than trying imperfectly. That is one of the stupidest bargains an adult can make. Fay Philosite Fay turn 68 file 0 Fay. This is why I want you to hear one sentence very clearly. Starting late is not the same thing as losing. Starting late and then using lateness as permission to stay stupid is losing. That is the distinction. And the source closing framework is one I respect. Preparation, discipline, patience, and decisiveness. Read before the emergency, learn before the opportunity, save before the recession, understand before the market asks you to act. Then wait. Then when a genuine opportunity finally arrives inside your circle of competence, act with force rather than nibbling from fear. That is how the late game works. Long periods of quiet preparation. Then aggressive clarity when the odds finally line up. The source uses the image of the crocodile, still for hours, then suddenly decisive. Good. That is how midlife wealth should often look. Fayfelicite, Fayturn, 68 file 0 Fay. This is also why I reject the myth that late wealth is about constant hustle. Number it is about fewer stupid mistakes, stronger pattern recognition, deeper learning, tighter self-knowledge, better emotional control, and more decisive use of the right moment. That is a very different skill stack. It is quieter, it is harder, it is less ego-friendly, and it works. So let me tell you what I think building wealth after 40 really requires. Once you strip away all the slogans, you need to stop confusing activity with progress. You need to stop borrowing force you cannot safely repay. You need to live below your means, not slightly above them with elegant excuses. You need to become more reliable than talented. You need to keep learning until your mind becomes a machine that updates rather than defends. You need to know your circle and treat ignorance as hazardous material. You need to become rational enough to examine your own denial before life does it for you more expensively. You need to protect and enlarge runway. That is the real checklist. Not sexy, not viral, not cinematic, but true. And truth compounds. The world will still offer you opportunities after 40, after 50, after 60. The source is right about that too. Opportunities do not disappear. The question is whether you will be ready when they arrive. Preparation is what lets opportunity matter. Capital low debt, clarity, emotional control. A working circle of competence, those are what turn chance into outcome. Without them, opportunity can stand right in front of you and still pass through your life like weather. This is why the real enemy is not age. It is repeated stupidity. That is what keeps the future looking like the past. If your financial life after 40 still feels stuck, it is probably not because fate selected you for special punishment. It is because a pattern has been repeating: overspending, delay, emotion, overconfidence, denial, drift. The source says that whatever is holding you back is not random, it is consistent. That is exactly the right way to think. Patterns are not destiny. They are simply loops that have not yet been interrupted. Fayfelicite, Fayturn, 68 file 0 Fay. And loops can be interrupted. That is the hopeful part, not fake hope. Operational hope. The kind built from doing less stupid things this year than last year. The kind built from saving with boring consistency. The kind built from reading when nobody is applauding. The kind built from writing down your mistakes instead of romanticizing them. The kind built from respecting your runway enough to stop setting fire to it for the sake of looking brilliant. So here is my final judgment. Getting rich after 40 is not a mystery. It is a discipline of subtraction. Subtract leverage. Subtract overspending. Subtract unreliability. Subtract stagnation. Subtract emotional reactivity. Subtract ego outside your circle. Subtract denial. Do that consistently, and time, even with a shorter runway, begins working with you again. Not perfectly. Enough and enough is far more powerful than most late starters are willing to admit, because enough runway, enough discipline, enough capital, enough patience, and enough rationality can still produce dignity, autonomy, and meaningful wealth. That is what matters now. Not whether you started ideally, whether you stopped being stupid in the same ways that kept shortening your runway. That is the whole game. And if you can finally play that game honestly, then after 40 is not the chapter where opportunity ends. It is the chapter where excuses should.